So now that we improved this form submission experience, I want to improve it even further. And I want to make sure that we actually also tell the user if invalid data has been entered, because at the moment I would be able to submit an empty form, and that's of course not how it should work. Now, one way of adding validation is that we simply add some extra attributes to our form elements. The required attribute, for example, can be added to all the inputs and text areas to make sure that the browser shows an error automatically without us doing anything if such a field that's marked as required is empty. That's useful and something you definitely should consider doing, because it's a quick and easy way of making your form safer and giving the user some feedback, but it's not enough, because this can always be disabled. So here, if I add it, a user would be able to inspect that form element and simply remove that required prop here, that required attribute, in the browser developer tools. Of course, not all users know about these tools, but a lot of users do. And therefore, with that, I now would be able to submit the invalid form again. So that's not enough. It's a good first step to improve the user experience, but not enough. Therefore, you should actually also always validate submitted data on the server, because that's the only place where the user can't do anything about your code. Hence, you should also validate the submitted data here in that server action. So here, I want to add an if check and check if title is maybe undefined, or if title has a length, maybe after trimming it to remove excess whitespace, of 0, which means it would be an empty string. In that case, I have an error. The same is true if the content does not exist or is an empty string. And if I don't have an image, so if that's undefined or something like that, I also want to return an error. So when one of these three if checks is met, I want to return an error. Or actually, what I want to do here is I want to create an errors array, and then I want to add new error messages for every check that fails. So here, for the first check, I want to add a new message to that array of error messages that, for example, says title is required. And then for the second check, I want to add a message that says content is required. And for the third check, I add a message that says image is required. That would be one way of constructing such an error message array. But of course, having that array here is not enough. We also need to get it back to the client side to update the DOM and show those error messages to the user in case they did try to submit an empty or invalid form. And how do we do that? Well, it would definitely be nice if we could simply check here in our server action if this errors array has a length that's greater than 0, which means it's not empty, which means we have at least one error. And if in that case, we could simply return an object here from our server action that includes that errors array as a property. That would be nice to do, right? If we could just return such an object, and then we could handle it on the client side. And it turns out we can do that. Next.js and React got us covered, because React offers another form-related hook, the useFormState hook. So not useFormStatus, which we used before, but useFormState. And that's a hook that you can use to update the form-related UI you're showing to the user based on some state that may be changed upon the submission of a form. Which is a complex way of saying you can use this hook to output any data you return from your form action, from your server action in this case. Therefore, here, I'll import this useFormState hook from React DOM. Again, it's imported from React DOM, not from React itself. And we can now call this hook in our component that outputs the form, useFormState, like this. So now I'm not calling it in some nested component as I did it with useFormStatus, which we called in the formSubmit component, but instead directly in the component that also outputs the form. Now useFormState then takes a value, or actually two values. And the first value this hook accepts is the form action that should actually eventually be triggered when the form is submitted. So therefore, I'll actually call it after defining that form action. And then I will pass that form action, this createPost function, to useFormState as a first argument. I'm not executing it. Instead, I'm just passing a pointer to this function as a first argument to useFormState. And then as a second argument, we pass some initial form state that should be used if the form action has not executed yet. And here in my case, that will be an empty object because the form state I might eventually get will be this object that has an errors property which contains an array of error messages. That's the form state we may eventually get. Because if the form submission succeeds, if we have valid data, we don't return any new state that should be shown on the screen. Instead, we navigate away here. So the only other state we can achieve is this errors state. But initially, we of course don't have any errors yet because the user didn't even have a chance of entering something. And therefore, my initial state for this form should be such an empty object. And we'll use that state in just a second. No worries. But that's what we pass into useFormState. Then useFormState returns two values, exactly two values. Just like the standard useState hook that's built into React, that hook would also return an array with exactly two elements. useFormState is kind of similar, just related to forms, you could say. It gives you the current form state, so that initial state initially, and then thereafter any other state that might have been returned by the form action. The form action you passed as a first argument to useFormState. And the second element you get back from useFormState will be an updated form action, which is essentially this form action which you pass to useFormState. But this action here, which you get back from useFormState, is essentially such a form action to which React is listening and able to, get hold of any data returned by that form action. Because this useFormState hook then will make sure that any data returned by your form action will be set up as a new state. That's why you get back a new form action to which React basically is listening to make sure that it is able to update that state. And therefore, it's now this updated form action which you should use as a value for the action prop of the form, so that React is able to listen to the submission and update that form state. Now, with that, if you would save that, you would get an error, though, that useFormState only works in a client component. Therefore, what you should do when using useFormState, you should add useClient at the top of the file. So here at the top of this page.js file. With that, if you reload, you get another error though, that we now also have some code that's decorated with useServer inside of a client component, and that's not allowed. Which kind of makes sense, I guess, because with useClient at the top of this file, we're telling React that all the code in here should be executed on the client side. But then we got some code in there where we tell React and Next.js that it should only be executed on the server side, which are some clashing expectations. But we can easily work around that problem by just restructuring our code a bit.